Alright, as much fun as it is to talk about bad movies sometimes, it was so great to sit down in a theater today and watch something that I had a pretty strong assumption that I would enjoy. And Dune Part 2 is one of the first big films of 2024 that I think there was a large amount of anticipation for from the general public. Hopefully this is going to make a lot of money. So let's talk about this massive sequel to a huge hit from 2021. My history with Dune is a bit interesting. I have not read the books. I want to put that disclaimer out now. And this is a two-part movie series. We might get a third one eventually, but it adapts the first book. From what I've heard, this does take a few creative liberties and switch up a few things from the book, but for the most part, I think it's pretty faithful of an adaptation. When part 1 came out in 2021, for whatever reason, I decided to sit down and watch it on HBO Max instead of going to theaters. I have no idea what I was thinking. I must have just been in a mood that day and for whatever reason didn't want to drive out to a theater, but that's the way to experience these movies for sure. And while I did enjoy part 1, the first time I watched it, I don't think I got the same amount of grasp of the source material as I did watching it a second time. I did rewatch it a few days ago in preparation for this, and I think I got more out of it and I like it a lot more than I did back then. I still don't think it's perfect though. It very much feels like a part 1 of a two-part story. It really felt like those first two acts of part 1 were building towards a climax that we never got. And so that was my main hope going into this, is that it would feel like a more traditional 3-act story. This is a little bit longer than the first one. Now let's start by getting the obvious out of the way. You're going to hear this in literally every review of this movie that you watch, but Dune Part 2 looks incredible. Denis Villeneuve is one of the few auteur filmmakers out there who studios seem to trust with their money to actually give his full unfiltered vision on the screen, and that's what you get in Dune Part 2. I don't think they wasted a single penny in this movie's budget. The visual effects are amazing. The cinematography is top-notch. Literally every technical spec you can think of is incredible. Hans Zimmer's score, I'm about to pull that thing up on Spotify and listen to it in a few minutes. The acting, too, is another thing that I want to get into, but first I guess we'll talk about the story a little bit, and I don't know, this review might come off as a little bit jumbled, but I don't want to spend too much time on any one specific topic because, again, so many people have already posted their reviews for this and a lot of them are kind of saying the same things. The story picks up in Dune Part 2 right where the last one left off. Paul Atreides and his mother, Lady Jessica, are with the Fremen, learning and integrating into their culture. The Harkonnens have completely taken over Arrakis, and although we do have a lot of returning characters, there are also some new ones introduced, most notably Christopher Walken as the Emperor and Florence Pugh as his daughter. And the first two acts of this movie are basically that. It's more build-up, which is not a bad thing by any means. I think the first two acts are my favorite parts of Dune Part 2 because they do such a magnificent job of world building, getting to see the Emperor finally after hearing about him in the first movie but never seeing him. We also get more of the Harkonnens' homeworld, which is pure nightmare fuel, kind of giving off horror movie vibes at times. But most notably, we spend a lot of time with Paul and his mother as they're, again, integrating into the culture of the Fremen, learning to sandwalk, learning to ride sandworms. All this stuff is so cool, and you see Paul in this mental turmoil where he's being torn between his family duty. On one hand, he wants to get revenge on the Harkonnens and take back what was once his family's, but there is also a faction of the Fremen that see him as this messiah figure, and he sees visions of the future, which leads him to believe maybe he is destined to be that person. And if I had another complaint about Part 1, it was that I felt a little bit disconnected from the characters and that they maybe didn't provide the amount of depth that I wanted. And I do feel that in this a tiny bit as well, but much less so, especially because they develop Paul so well here. A lot of the first two acts is spent with Paul, simply living with these people in the desert, forming a bond with Johnny. Meanwhile, all this other really interesting world-building stuff is going on behind the scenes. I guess some people aren't huge on Timothée Chalamet as this character. I think he's fantastic. It's that added amount of character depth in this part that makes the character even better for me. I'll admit there were points where I did feel a little bit disconnected from the lore because I haven't read the books, and maybe if I did, it would be able to expand more on some of the things that are introduced in here, particularly the storyline involving Paul's mother. And there's also the fact that they're taking such a massive amount of material and trying to fit it into this 5-hour, I guess it'd be more than 5 hours if you put these two parts together, space epic, essentially. And that's where I get into one of my main problems with the movie, is that the third act feels kind of rushed, because after the first film, again, we have another, 2 hours or so of build-up to this final act that feels like a tipping point in the story. And things just happen kind of fast and abruptly, and I don't want to get any more specific than that because I don't want to reveal any spoilers. I think you should absolutely go into this knowing as little as possible. And this is not me saying that the third act is bad by any means. It's just that certain things happen that I figured would happen at some point, and it pushes through them a lot quicker than I would have expected. And after all of that buildup, I wouldn't have minded if they just let these action sequences breathe a bit more. With that said, the action is fantastic. I didn't spend a single moment looking at the screen thinking, that's really obvious CG right there. No, everything looks so real and well done. I want to pick out a couple performances that stuck out for me. First of all, Dave Bautista. He gets a lot more screen time in this than he did in the first one. And although his character doesn't have a ton of depth, he's kind of the big, brutish, second-in-command bad guy, but he brings an intensity to this role that I just really respect him as an actor. Of all of the wrestlers turned actors, I think he is among the best of them. You can tell he just puts a lot of passion into every project that he's in. As someone who isn't a massive Zendaya fan, I actually really liked her too, and she conveys a lot of strong emotions in this without talking, which isn't easy to do as an actor. Austin Butler joins the cast as Fade Harkonnen. He's the nephew of the Baron, and my god, this guy is terrifying. It's a rare occurrence in a movie like this where when a villain steps into frame, you're just automatically scared of what they're gonna do. This guy is the embodiment of that. Not only does he look like one of those monsters from I Am Legend, but he also just snaps on a dime without warning. True psychopath. I believed it because of the performance. I absolutely loved this character, one of my favorite parts of the film. I could rave about the cast all day. There really isn't a single bad performance in here. Everybody delivered. I just wanted to point out a couple that were really good. If I had to pick somebody that I think was underutilized, let's talk about Christopher Walken for a second here, because this is a character that I expected to be a much larger part of the story, considering he's really the main antagonist of the series, and he does not have much screen time at all. And again, it's not that the performance was bad or anything. I just feel like Christopher Walken wasn't really given much material to work with. He shows up for a few minutes, then he's gone for an hour, and then he comes back into the frame, delivers a few lines, and then he's gone again. I know this film is already 3 hours long as is, but I almost feel like they could have stretched it out even longer to give some of these other locations and new characters more room to breathe, because so much of the first couple of acts are focused on the Fremen that some of the other locations feel a bit like an afterthought. But for the most part, I'm happy to report that Dune Part 2 is awesome. It's definitely an improvement on its predecessor. I think it's a little bit better. Again, not a masterpiece per se. I've seen so many people making hyperbolic statements about this, comparing it to The Empire Strikes Back and The Two Towers. I think both of those are better films, but I mean, by all means, this is epic. It's awesome. I will not be surprised in the slightest if this ends up in my top 10 or top 15 of the year. So let's give Dune Part 2 4.5 out of 5. This lived up to expectations. I'm happy to report that we finally have something this year to talk about that is genuinely great. I do want to mention that Denis Villeneuve has talked about adapting Dune Messiah, which is, I guess, the next chapter in the story. But for those who are wondering, this does end in a place where, like, if you stopped watching the series after this one and this was the end of the story for you, I think there's enough conclusion there for you to be satisfied, because that was one of my issues with the first one. It just ended so abruptly. This gives you a proper conclusion if this is where you want to end it. I just love original sci-fi so much, and the fact that this is able to stand out from the pack, because it's not that similar to something like Star Wars. You could almost say it's a Star Wars with the tone of Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones, but it leaves its own unique stamp on the genre, and that's why I think it'll be talked about for years to come. As always, guys, drop down into the comments and let me know what you thought of Dune Part 2, and which one do you think is better? I would say Part 2 is better than Part 1, but that's just me. Be sure to hit that like button and subscribe while you're at it if you want to see more content like this, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. See you later.